Che Guevara became the face of the revolution. Today, his image on t-shirts and posters symbolizes rebellion, but Guevara's bloody tactics have also branded him as an evil tyrant. Guevara was a brutal idealist who fought for the poor, using any means necessary. But was he a hero or an evil criminal? Born in Argentina, Guevara studied medicine at the University of Buenos Aires. In 1952, the medical student spent a year riding his motorcycle across South America. That trip would change Guevara's life. During his travels, Guevara witnessed poverty and horrific working conditions firsthand. In Chile, he met a couple so poor they didn't own a blanket, yet a nearby copper mine owned by a US monopoly poured wealth into Chile. After the trip, Guevara set aside his dream of helping people as a doctor. Instead, he became a revolutionary. "I will be on the side of the people," Guevara wrote in his diary. "I will take to the barricades and the trenches, screaming as one possessed, will stain my weapons with blood and, mad with rage, will cut the throat of any vanquished foe I encounter." Che Guevara's first stop was Guatemala. His target was the United Fruit Company, an American corporation that relied on cheap labor to sell bananas. Guevara vowed, "I won't rest until I see these capitalist octopuses annihilated." But in Guatemala, Guevara found more than bananas. He walked into a US-backed coup. The coup targeted Jaboco Arbenz, Guatemala's democratically elected president. As president, Arbenz pushed for agrarian reforms and tax increases on the United Fruit Company and other wealthy landowners. When mysterious, unmarked planes started dropping bombs on Guatemala's capital, Guevara blamed the US. And Guevara was right. President Dwight Eisenhower and his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had ordered the overthrow of Guatemala's government. In fact, the CIA worked directly with the United Fruit Company to orchestrate the coup. Dulles even owned stock in the United Fruit Company, and his brother sat on its board of directors. Guevara spent months fighting against the US-backed forces. Yet the coup successfully ousted President Arbenz and installed a military dictatorship. As Guevara fled Guatemala, he called the coup cold, premeditated aggression carried out by the United States. Guevara had seen poverty and exploitation. He'd seen the power of US imperialism, and he decided that armed struggle was the only way to fight back against capitalism. In 1955, Che Guevara met Fidel Castro in Mexico City. Instantly, Guevara recognized Castro as an anti-imperialist ally. Just hours after they met, Guevara joined Castro's plot to overthrow Cuba. To tell the truth, Che Guevara later wrote, "After my experiences across Latin America, I didn't need much more to enlist for a revolution against a tyrant." Guevara signed on as a combat medic and trained as a guerrilla in the mountains of Mexico. Castro's target was another US-backed military dictator, Cuba's president Fulgencio Batista. On November 25, 1956, Guevara and 80 other men boarded a small, leaky ship and sailed for Cuba. After a week battling choppy seas, the revolutionaries landed at the southeastern tip of Cuba. But Batista's forces were waiting. Helicopters swarmed on the landing site, scattering the revolutionaries and slaughtering anyone who couldn't find cover. Of the 80 men who landed with Castro and Guevara, only 22 survived. The survivors fled into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. They hid in the homes of poor farmers who welcomed the rebel army. Again, Guevara saw poverty firsthand. The people had no electricity and no schools. Guevara wanted to change that. During his years hiding in the mountains, he set up health clinics and schools. Guevara also proved himself a ruthless leader. He shot deserters, declaring them traitors to the cause. He also executed suspected spies and informants. When a peasant ally confessed he'd sold information about the rebel army to Batista's forces, Guevara stepped up. "I ended the problem, giving him a shot with a .32 pistol," Guevara wrote. Castro promoted Guevara to be his second in command. The rebels spent years battling Batista's forces using guerrilla tactics. In late 1958, Guevara led a risky 7-week march toward Havana. At the Battle of Santa Clara, Guevara's forces captured a strategic city, cutting off Batista's access to half of the country. When the news reached Havana, Batista fled the country. Thanks to Guevara, Castro now controlled Cuba. Once in power, Guevara took charge of two areas: revolutionary justice and land reform. He led the revolutionary tribunals that executed dozens of Batista officials. Violence was the only way to protect the people, Guevara declared. The executions by firing squads are not only a necessity for the people of Cuba, but also an imposition of the people, he wrote. As Castro nationalized factories and businesses, Guevara seized nearly 500,000 acres owned by American corporations. He redistributed the land to Cuba's poor. Castro and Guevara radically transformed Cuba. Guevara personally oversaw the Year of Education in 1961. In a single year, 700,000 illiterate Cubans learned to read, and the country's literacy rate jumped from 60% to 96%. But the United States saw Castro's Cuba as a threat. The country's Marxist ideals and close relationships with the Soviets worried the superpower. In 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion sent CIA-trained Cuban exiles to the island, backed by U.S. military planes dropping bombs. But Cubans trained by Guevara to defend their country repelled the invaders. After the Bay of Pigs, Guevara argued that the U.S. wasn't a beacon of freedom. Democracy is not compatible with financial oligarchy, with discrimination against blacks and outrages by the Ku Klux Klan, the revolutionary scolded. In 1962, Guevara helped put Soviet missiles on Cuban soil. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. But when the Soviets backed down, Guevara raged against the decision. Guevara told a British newspaper, "If the rockets had remained, we would have used them all," and directed them against the very heart of the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis convinced Guevara that the Soviet Union had abandoned true Marxism. The world's superpowers didn't truly care about Cuba, Guevara concluded. The country had simply become a pawn in their battle. In 1965, Guevara vanished. He gave up his government positions. For 2 years, he crossed the globe in secret, helping other revolutionary movements. In the Congo, Guevara fought against a CIA-backed military dictator. In Bolivia, he battled another military dictator supported by the US. But in 1967, an informant gave up Guevara's location. Bolivian forces captured and shot Guevara against the orders of the US government. Guevara dedicated his life to fighting for the poor and powerless. Although he trained as a doctor, Guevara's experiences in the streets of Guatemala and the jungles of Cuba convinced him that revolutions required violence. His brutal methods, including firing squads for his enemies and even the threat of nuclear annihilation. Guevara argued that his goals justified his methods. So was Che Guevara a hero or an evil criminal? It all depends on your perspective. Guevara would probably say you're either with the capitalist octopuses or you're against them.